Thank you, Brother Ken, and good morning, my dear brothers and sisters. Fellow pilgrims on the journey of hope. We've already seen, so this part will be quite easy for you to pick up. We've already seen at least twice the concern of the Apostle Paul for the ecclesias that he established, that he wanted to go back frequently to those places and to strengthen them and build them up. We could almost skip that, but we do want to look at it a bit more carefully and understand how big an issue that was for the apostle and therefore how important it is for us too. The apostle was very desirous of strengthening all the disciples that he had become aware of. And so if we come to Acts 18 as a first example, verse 23. And after he had spent some time there, that's in Antioch, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. And that's the lead into the chronological sequence that we're trying to follow as well, although that may not always be so obvious too, because I know I'm dealing with this subject much more thematically than chronologically, but believe it or not, there is a chronological sequence in what I'm saying. And we're picking up now this third missionary journey. It's an extraordinary journey for a number of reasons, because when we see that he has arrived at Ephesus in chapter 19, verse 1, he meets Apollos and so on, the story goes on there. But if you come a little further down to chapter 2, verse 8, there is a reference to how long he spent there in Ephesus. And he went into the synagogue and spake boldly for the space of 3 months. But then you come down to verse 10. This continued by the space of 2 years. And if you come over to chapter 20, verse 31, you will see that in all he spent 3 years at Ephesus. Therefore watch and remember that by the space of 3 years I ceased not to warn every one of you night and day with tears. This is the longest time Paul spent anywhere apart from his upbringing in Tarsus and his later time there after his conversion. Once he left Tarsus, if you wanted to say anywhere was his permanent abode or semi-permanent abode, it would be Ephesus. I've made the point, I think probably the first study, that Antioch became his kind of home. But in terms of length of time, Ephesus was the longest. And we've made the point, whether it be Iconium or whether it be Antioch or wherever, Corinth, that the impact he must have had for those extended periods would have been outstanding. Well, here we've run out of superlatives, or I have anyway. You kind of have to say, well, that 3 years would even be greater. I'm reminded of driving through the Rockies and looking at a mountain and going, wow, look at that fantastic view. And after about half a dozen of those, you just go, huh? Wow. There's no words left. It's just awesome scenery. And you cannot think of any more words to say. You've run out. And we need to think of it in that way, I believe, that the apostle probably it's difficult to get into his mind, is what I'm saying. We can read it, and it's a story that's straightforward. It's not a complicated story. But to try and understand how he felt about these disciples, one of the ways is to see that he was so anxious to build them up that in this instance in Ephesus he would spend 3 whole years there. And it's apparent too that he went around the surrounding area as well, as you can imagine you might. Wherever you happen to live, you would visit areas nearby. as a matter of course, and you get to know people in a wider circle. But it's a bit more of an effort to go interstate, or and even more so to go overseas. And it's clear that the apostles did speak around the area of Ephesus in the province of Asia to some degree, whilst he was based in Ephesus. Well, after that period, we'll come back to that in a moment, the journey, as we described it, goes on. He arrives in Macedonia, in Greece. You'll see in chapter 20, verse 2, he's there for 3 months as well. And it goes on, whole list of places, and eventually back in Jerusalem. So that's this journey. We call it the third missionary journey, rightly so, and it lasted for 5 years, but 3 of those were in Ephesus. So it's almost, as we said yesterday, it's really 2 journeys. It's a journey to Ephesus, then based there for 3 years, and then another journey back to Jerusalem. Not to Antioch, just by the way, notice. And so like we saw with the second journey, it's almost really 2 journeys that we lump together and call it a single journey. And this is illustrated also with a table. You can see in the middle there the 3 years at Ephesus and 3 months in Greece. And so there's really quite a strong break between the 2 halves, the top and the bottom. And so it's reasonable to describe it almost as 2 separate journeys. Well, this place, Ephesus, like the other places he stayed at for long periods, was a significant place. This is quoting from Brother John Carter in his letter to the Ephesians book. Ephesus was a wealthy, populous, important city, the capital of the province of Asia. The province as a whole was prosperous and was covered with numerous towns such as those addressed in the Apocalypse. In Paul's day, Ephesus was at the height of its prosperity. It was situated at the mouth of the Meander and at the entrance to the principal trade route to the interior. It was the residence of the Roman proconsul, in whose court the majesty of Rome was amply displayed. The city also had a religious attraction. On the site of the primitive sanctuary, a temple had been erected, and here was maintained a survival of nature worship. The goddess was identified by the Greeks with Artemis and with Diana by the Romans. The temple was one of the wonders of the world, and to it pilgrimage was made. Superstition and magic had a stronghold, and many vested interests supported the religious practices. And of course our knowledge from Acts, particularly of Paul's time there, will recognise a lot of those features. But why would you even think of going to Ephesus in the first place if that's what it's like? We haven't got the same comment as was the case with Corinth, that I have much people in this city, but clearly the Lord did. And it's just another reminder of something we've discussed before, of the difficulty we have in being able to tell whether God has much people in any given location. It's very difficult for us to know in that sense what the will of the Lord is. And I guess it's just a reminder for us not to be too smart in our own thinking. Leave a bit more to the Lord to guide us, because so often where we thought it would be pointless going to stay in that place and to preach and to try and spread the gospel, turns out to be a very fruitful field. And sometimes areas we think would be fruitful turn out not to be. I think it's just a salutary lesson for us. We have a lot of information about the ecclesia at Ephesus. We've touched on most of these references in Acts, but just to remind you, he stopped there on his way to Jerusalem back in chapter 18. We've read about Apollos. We've now talked about his 3-year stay, and on his way back to Jerusalem, he meets the elders at Miletus. We also then find that others were involved in that ecclesia. Paul left Timothy there during his travels after his release from prison. We pick that up in 1 Timothy 1. And of course, Jesus wrote a letter to that ecclesia in Revelation chapter 2. Clearly a very significant ecclesia. And why wouldn't it have been after 3 years of the apostles' work in that place, in building it up and establishing it? Well, we'll now expand beyond Ephesus. But I just want to show you one little snippet from this third journey. You may or may not really have thought about this much, but in Acts 20, verse 13, Luke records, "And we went before to ship and sailed unto Assos, there intending to take in Paul, for so he had appointed, minding himself to go afoot." Well, that map illustrates the place that we're talking about. At the top is Troas. They got to Troas, and the boat continued down the coast and around the bottom to Assos in the bottom right-hand corner. But the Apostle Paul alone said, "I'm going to walk across country and I'll meet you at Assos." That's the only time I think that we come across that sort of odd incident. All the rest of them sailed around in the ship around the coast. I haven't tried to work out which is faster. I'm guessing the ship would be faster depending on the prevailing winds. And so how they timed this, did he say, "Well, I'll meet you on a certain day," or I don't know. The details are interesting but not significant. What is significant is that he felt the need for exercise, but to be alone. And there's an interesting little summary of this by Brother Michael Owen in an article some years ago. Luke seems to have enjoyed travel, and particularly by sea, whereas Paul decided to take the opportunity for quiet reflection and exercise by walking from Troas some 20 miles south to Assos. Luke chose to go by sea. I'm sure there's times in our lives where we feel the need to be alone. Sometimes we are alone not by choice, and that can be very difficult too, of course. But there are times, and it may not be for such a long period, that would take a couple of days, I guess, to walk 20 miles. I've never tried to do that in one go, but I'm sure it's not just a couple of hours, that's for sure. And there are times when, for whatever reason, there is a need for some real reflection and meditation, and that's part of the apostle's life. He wasn't so driven that he could not take such a break, not just from preaching, but from even his fellow brethren on the ship. Of course, we ought not to reverse the picture and say that, well, we'll just spend our life in isolation and have nothing to do with the brethren, except maybe once a year we'll go and visit somewhere. I think that's not healthy and not wise. But clearly, even the apostle needed this little short period in his otherwise incredibly busy and compact life for quiet reflection. And I think that's just a very interesting little observation along the way. Now, I've tried to summarise the Apostle Paul's care for the ecclesias. We read that in our reading, if you want to come with me to that. We'll pick it up just to reinforce it again. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 28 has been read for us. He says, beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the ecclesias. And we'll tease this out a little more. But first of all, after the first journey, the apostle wanted to go on his second journey, which we've covered previously. He wanted to see how they do. Having gone through the second journey and thinking about a third journey, we read that he wanted to strengthen all the disciples. And so twice, preceding the second and the third journey, You can see his desire, in particular in Galatia, because that's where he founded the first ecclesias, to go back and to go back again. And that's a very powerful lesson for all of us, and we'll see that, how that relates to our own time as we develop this thought. But there are many other things the apostle did and says about himself that expand on this. So, for example, in this chapter, maybe not as obvious as the one in 1 Corinthians 4, but verse 2 we've already had reason to quote. He talks about espousing you to one husband. Well, who does that? Who espouses their daughter to a husband but the father? And we may not normally pick that out of that verse, but he is saying, I'm effectively your father. The ecclesia at Corinth, I'm your father. And so I'm espousing you, I have espoused you to Christ. So his view of his role, of his position and his relationship to these brethren was as a father. Towards the latter part of the chapter, of course, he talks about how much he had suffered for them. Not just those physical troubles that he experienced on behalf of all of the brethren, but in particular this care of all the ecclesias daily. We'll come back to that. We've noticed that he resided in particular in Corinth and Ephesus for several years each. Such was his care and concern for them. He wrote 14 letters, and some others at least, that we haven't got in our scriptures, but which we can deduce. We've seen that he prayed for them frequently. They were always in his prayers. And he furthermore sent others to help them, Timothy and Titus, for example. So all of this is illustrative of his lifelong care for the brethren, not just preaching and moving on. Well, what about us? I'm not trying to say we should somehow tick off that list and say, yes, I've done this, I've done this. I don't mean it that way. But what about our care for others? And not simply individuals. There's certainly a very important place for our care for individuals in need. But our thoughts this morning are not about the individuals. They are about the body of Christ, the ecclesia. What's our attitude to the whole body of Christ? What sort of concerns or caring thoughts do we have for the whole brotherhood? Or do in fact we think of the brotherhood as a whole much at all? Are we so preoccupied with our own lives and perhaps just our own ecclesia and maybe one or two others nearby? That's it, as far as our thinking goes, most of the time. Or are we so much more conscious of the fact that we are but a tiny part of this worldwide brotherhood? And all of those brethren and sisters, whatever country they're in and whatever colour their skin, whatever language they speak, are as close to us as the brother or sister sitting next to us here, in our minds. And many of us have travelled and visited places where we are able to meet with a few of these brothers and sisters. And I'm sure we've all found in those experiences this amazing sense of unity and of closeness with people we have never met, not even thought of. I haven't met all of you before, but there's a kind of semi-knowledge of each other. We kind of know of your ecclesia, or we may know someone else in your ecclesia, and there's a certain amount of ready familiarity here, isn't there? But if you go to some country where they don't look like you and they don't talk like you, there's a stronger sense of Christ has bridged the gaps that would otherwise be there between our cultures and theirs. And it really needs to be something, I think, very prominent in our thinking, in our prayers, in our discussion, in the way our ecclesia functions. And there are many ways that can be done. But one of the things I want to say to us, most of us, there's one or two here who are younger than me, so I can kind of, not entirely, but sort of drop them out of my comments here, although it's relevant really to everyone. We're all elders in the ecclesia. We have a very special responsibility. It isn't simply that we've grown old. I know some of you don't like saying old. I'm quite comfortable with saying I'm old. I don't have a problem with that, but I know some of you are a bit sensitive about that. But so just forgive me if I might make you feel uncomfortable unintentionally. We've got to this stage. We've learnt a lot. We have learnt a huge amount through the scriptures, through life experience. Why? What are you doing with it? What was the point of all that? Simply so that you could die with a head full of knowledge? No. We're all here because we're elders in the ecclesia of God. We have a great responsibility to act in our individual ecclesias, particularly as elders, and to do those things that elders should do. The apostle was clearly an elder. Okay, he had a special commission, and we cannot draw a perfect parallel between us and the apostle in that sense. But there's a few clues there, isn't there, about what elders are to do, what you and I must do. And we should all feel a little uncomfortable, I do, as to what extent am I even thinking about being an elder? Or have I got sucked into our Western culture and saying that, well, this time of life is where we sit back and enjoy the fruits of our labours, we take it easy, we buy a more comfortable lounge chair, whatever, because we've done the hard yards. Let the young ones pick this up. And I'm not trying to make too many allusions to last night, but on the serious side of last night, it should make us think a little, that it's clearly important for us to not only pass on the baton, which is a very apt analogy. That doesn't mean you say, well, I finally got rid of that job, I can sit back and relax. That isn't the idea. We ought to maintain, in fact, if you could think through this, even have more enthusiasm than we had when we were young. Because now we understand what we're enthusiastic about so much better. We ought to be so excited by the fact that we've matured to the degree we have, that we see things so much better than we did when we were 20 or 30 years old. Don't we? Sure we do. But what's the impression we give to our younger brothers and sisters? Do we have a rapport with them at all? Do we chat with the young brother after he's given a talk and give very constructive and tactful advice and support them, encourage them, give them as many roles as they can manage, bearing in mind they have a young family usually. And we need to ensure that they have time with their children and with their wives, particularly talking about young brethren. You know, a study has been done in Australia of how much time the typical father spends with his children per day, one-on-one. It's less than 1 minute. If that ever is true of any young brother, that's shocking. Our families, in most cases, become the future family of God. And a father must never, ever abrogate that responsibility. And we as elders need to be conscious of how much we load on young brethren, particularly with younger children. a little bit off the subject, but it's, I think, a very pertinent message for us as people who've got past that stage generally. There are some other terms used, quite a few terms used by the apostle, but by extension applying to all of us. We won't turn them up. These are familiar ones, I'm sure, to you. We are described in Scripture, and the apostle uses this term of himself as being a shepherd. And we don't need to think long about what that implies, of being out in front and looking for the green pastures and the water for the sheep, of making sure that there are no obstacles in their way, of making sure that any wild animals are sent off or killed if necessary. The shepherd had this job. He would give his life for the sheep. We're shepherds. So tick all those off in your mind. We are also servants. All of us are servants. All ages are servants, but we in particular. We don't say, well, we've done our service and we've reached whatever age you think is enough, not 50, Brother John. We don't say, well, let the young ones take over now. We are servants of the brotherhood. We have many other terms, members of a body. We're all indispensable parts, as Paul goes through in 1 Corinthians, and emphasises the fact that none of us can say either the body doesn't need me or I don't need the body. Neither are valid comments or thoughts. We have to think about being followers of Christ, and as he has done and does for us, still we need to do for one another, because we're members of his family. And of course it's so helpful to us to, as we do, call each other's brothers and sisters. But I wonder sometimes if that term, that frequency of using that expression has kind of lost its point. If you've got a brother or sister in the flesh, you know that, as the saying is, blood is thicker than water. You know that you never ever lose that sense of a very special relationship, different to everyone else. And that special nature of our relationship as brothers and sisters needs to be at the forefront of our minds as much as possible. And so, as we look then more carefully at this whole issue of caring, in the chapter dealing with the body, 1 Corinthians 12, let's have a look at that. If you've still got 2 Corinthians there, it's not far away. 1 Corinthians 12. In going through this long description of the body and the different parts of the body and how it needs to see its interdependence, which would be interesting to look at, but not now. We come all the way down the chapter to verse 25, that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care one for another. Every one of us should have real, genuine care for one another. Now, I know some of you are difficult to care about. Some of you are a little bit odd. You've got these little idiosyncrasies. But then, so have I. So have you. We need to see through that and see, here is one of God's children. And we really need to have a strong sense of care. Let those idiosyncrasies wash over us. With some of you, I could give you quite a list. No, some of you I know well, and we all know that's true, don't we? We don't see them, of course. We don't see them, or we may see a little bit. But if you get very close to someone who's prepared to put a mirror up to you in a gentle way, you suddenly think, well, I suppose I am a bit odd, aren't I? And I have got some funny ways and some funny little prejudices. And, when you see that person, you go, oh, yeah, yes, that, steel yourself for this a little, We're all like that. We're not the odd one out. We're not the one person in this room who's normal. Because there's no such thing, really, is there? And somehow we have to ignore all that and have the same care one for another. Because it's the very epitome of family, of reflecting the way, as Brother John said so clearly today, the way God treated his people. People who didn't deserve any of the things that he did for them. In the face of their rebellion, he still blessed them. And that's the same care that we need to have for one another. When we've done things to one another that are offensive, upsetting, possibly unintentional, and who knows whether it was ever intentional or unintentional that someone said something to us that was very upsetting. How often have you done that? Blissfully ignorant, and the person's gone away deeply hurt, never said anything to you. I'm sure it's happened many times. We've all done it. But we have to see beyond those things. We have this absolutely beautiful statement about Timothy. Timothy will naturally care for your state. Wow, wouldn't that be lovely if we knew that's how the Lord saw us? That you, brother, you, sister, will naturally care for the state of another. What a beautiful thing that is. May that be so of all of us. But while we're talking about caring, there are things we're told not to care about. Don't care about this world. Don't care about this life. Don't care about tomorrow. Don't care about anything. And there, of course, the emphasis is on worry and anxiety. Sometimes we stick little cartoons on the fridge out of the newspaper or wherever. And some years ago we had a cartoon of husband and wife, or father and mother to make it even more clear. And the father says to the mother, why are you worrying so much? And she says, because I'm a mother, it's my job. And I'm not saying that mothers shouldn't have that care for their family in particular. But it's hard, isn't it? It's really hard not to worry. It's extremely difficult to cast all your care upon the Lord, for he careth for you. And it isn't because we don't trust him, I don't think. I think it's simply because we're weak. We're acutely conscious that there's so many things that we wish we could control, but we can't. And we worry and we lose sleep and we wet our pillows with our tears because we're worried. And I don't think we'll ever escape that until we're immortal. But we do at times need to somehow pull ourselves back from that and be a little more reflective about ourselves. Be conscious of the fact that we are in God's care and that we too care for one another. And we've addressed that a little bit previously, particularly talking about prayer and praying for others and telling them so. Because these are all ways of showing that we do care and that God cares. And we will all be caring for you and endeavour to help you and support you in your time of need. Now, I want to give a few examples or illustrations of all of this. Some of you will be well aware that Brother Robert Roberts had some very good points and some very bad points. One of his bad points was money. He was hopeless. And it's well written up. He acknowledges it all in great detail in his biography and in other material that we can read in copies of the Christadelphian of over 100 years ago, hopeless with money. And perhaps you might think of some other things that you might not think he was perfect in, but I want to just focus on that just for a moment. He invested his money and encouraged others to do so too in schemes that came to an absolute disaster, where they lost the lot. Not once, but again. And it would have been a third one if the brethren at Birmingham hadn't got him in a corner, so to speak, and just said, you must never, ever have anything more to do with handling money and recommending what people do with money. And he acknowledged the wisdom of their advice and agreed not to get involved in anything like this ever again. And you know the reason he came to Australia? Was very much tied up with that problem. There were two reasons in effect, but they're linked. One was because he was an incredibly sick man. He was very sick, in fact died at 59. Many of us are quite a bit older than that. And he did it because he got sick with distress and worry and disappointment. And with good reason, in the sense that he had dealt with some extraordinarily distressing situations, and it affected his health. And one of those complicating factors was the disasters that he got involved in financially as well. And you might think, well, surely somewhere in his earlier part of his life he would have figured out that he wasn't good with money. Or even others might have suggested that much earlier. Why did it get to such a huge scale, not once but twice and almost 3 times? And it's interesting, I think, just to read what his motive was. He wanted to get this money because he wanted to fund the Jewish colonisation of the Holy Land was to be helped, as no Gentile and no Jew after the flesh either feels moved to help it. The truth was to be published both by lecture and literature as it has never been in this generation. The poor were to be helped as never in our age has been possible. Every grievous load among the brethren under which private hearts are bleeding was to be undone. An institution for the annual recuperation of the ailing by a 3 weeks free stay, to which railway fare would be paid to and from, was to be provided. What are our motives for accumulating our wealth? Few of us probably could say even one of those was our motive. He had feet of clay, but I think I've got feet of sand. They won't support anything. I don't have those motives for what I have, and I suspect either none or perhaps few of you do. All of his care was for both natural Israel and spiritual Israel. If you read through all of the writings of Brother Roberts, as I've done recently, every article, every editorial, every news item, for the whole of his life, it becomes very clear that the overwhelming desire in his heart was to help his brethren, not merely by lecturing, not merely by writing wonderful and profound articles on some scriptural topic, but month after month after month he talks about this brother or this sister or this family who are destitute, and appealing for the brethren to contribute donations to help them. And you may well be aware that his own life was one where he never owned a house. In fact, That's not quite right. He did own a house. It was given to him by a brother for nothing. It was Brother Firth in Melbourne. Gave him, free of charge, Orient House, which is just still standing. I went and had a look at it earlier this year, and it's in a pretty poor state of repair. Might not last much longer. But he never bought it, never had, as it were, 2 cents to rub together. Because whatever he did have, it was all used for the benefit of others. An extraordinary man in that respect. His care was for others at his own expense, not just financially expense either. Now our reading was, as we just saw a moment ago, 2 Corinthians 11. And as you may have picked this up, but let's just make sure we don't miss it. Verse 28 said, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 28, beside those things that are without, and he's given us a long list of all these things that were without, all the privations that he went through. He says, beside all that, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the ecclesias. Now here's an interesting comment. I could do no better than just quote it from Brother Peter Watkins on this very point. We can all readily understand how these things that we've just read about would be painful to bear, each one of them a deep affliction. But there is one of them which Paul mentions amongst his afflictions, which many people simply would not be able to understand. Quoting, beside those things which are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches, verse 28. One gets the impression that this was the more grievous burden. You know, if those of you know me reasonably well, if I came up to you one day and just said, oh, curse the day I was born, I wish I was dead, you'd be a little worried, wouldn't you? A little anxious. Think, oh, goodness me, what's gone wrong and what's he thinking? That's an awful thing to say. You might even say that's actually a very sinful thing to have said. What would you have said after that experience that Job had? And of 7 days sitting on this pile of rubbish and scratching yourself and starting to think, what is going on? I don't blame him one bit for this outburst, and it goes on and on and on through this whole chapter. Explanations are not very often given. Very rarely can we, and even in Scripture, can we see the reason for things, the explanation of things. It may be, as we've seen, because we are being disciplined. And there's a really interesting one we just won't have time to look at in 1 Corinthians 11 in the context of the breaking of bread, by the way, which brethren often don't read on to that verse, and I'll leave that with you to think about. I've come across a way of commenting on this whole question in a book by Dr. James Dobson called When God Doesn't Make Sense. And I really think it captures the point. God allows things to happen. You know, we sometimes box people in, or even our own thinking, by asking them to say yes or no to a question. And I've said this to a few of you. I've come to the stage in my life where someone says to me, is it yes or no, black or white, up or down? I won't answer. I won't answer that question. Sorry, don't ask, don't try. Sometimes I will, but I usually go, hang on a minute. I think there's more than 2 options here. There's at least 3, and there may be 33 options. And you've just given me 2 of them. And sorry, I'm not going down that track. And the 2 options we sometimes put up, God either made that happen or he had nothing to do with it. Which is it? And my answer is it's neither. in many cases. In some cases, of course, it is those. Although God had nothing to do with it, that's not really a very accurate statement in itself, is it? Because we saw that on our first study with providence. God is in control of everything. God sends the rain. Oh, no, he doesn't. I know better than that. Science has taught me that, wait a minute, the Bible says God sends the rain. Do you believe it or don't you? Leave that with you. God allows things to happen. And I think that's a really helpful way of getting the balance right. God hasn't gone off like Baal hunting and you have to yell to get him back. He hasn't gone to sleep and you have to shout louder and louder to wake him up, as it was on Mount Carmel. That's not what our God's like. He doesn't slumber or sleep, ever. So he's intimately involved and he will allow many things to happen. And if he chooses to, he can disallow them to happen. And occasionally he clearly does. That's what a miracle is. He disallows things. But allowing means he's still involved. And it's okay as far as his purpose is concerned to allow that to happen. And I think that's a helpful way to define what God is doing very much of the time. And it's in chapter 3 here where we have at least 5 why to God from Job. Do you do that? You ever done that? Sure you have. Why is this happening? Why can't that be done? Why? We don't often get answers in the specific sense that we would wish. There are times, as I've alluded to, where it's difficult to be rational, to think beyond the pain, especially when under severe stress. And I read a book about suicide because I needed to think about that with some suicides that occurred amongst families that I know. And I read one very interesting comment about suicide from someone who had attempted it and failed. They said, I didn't really want to die. I just wanted to end the pain. And I think that's a really significant insight. That's what Job's saying. I don't actually want to die. It's not death that is somehow attractive in itself. I'd love to live on in reasonable health, but I'm under such incredible stress and pain and anguish. The only way I can see to stop this is to die. If there was another way, I'd go that way in preference, but I can't see any other way. And so I'd really love the clock to turn back and I'd never been born. Then I would never have to worry about this problem. It's not easy to think rationally under that extreme condition, and that's exactly the condition that Job is in. We need to also be very clear that God is never enticing us to sin. He is not doing anything to make us fall. He's not doing anything to make us stumble. So if we do, we can't blame him for that. And of course, we're told very plainly in Scripture more than once, that one's in 1 Peter 1, that he will frequently test our faith. You can never say to God in a prayer, well, you can, but there's no point. Should never say to God in a prayer, will you please back off and ease up on the trial of my faith, the testing of my faith? I'd like a break, thanks. No, never happen. Don't even think about it. Well, as we've picked up in our story earlier, Paul's been through a great deal of suffering. He was released, but he's now back in prison. Here he is back in prison, writing to Timothy, and that situation would not have been easy or comfortable, and we don't know how long for, perhaps a year, or who knows, might have even been another one of those 2-year periods that we've seen already. And so we come to 2 Timothy, his last words. 2 Timothy chapter 1, I will actually, you can try and keep up with me, but I'm going to go through this very quickly because I've run out of time again. In chapter 1, verse 16, he talks about his chains in Rome. And being the end of his life, and he knew it was, he realised he was not going to get out of prison this time, and that his days were clearly numbered. And so reflecting back over his whole life, he talks about the need for us all to endure hardness, to suffer trouble, to endure afflictions. To endure means to abide under, to bear up courageously under suffering, to have patience. And he talks about his persecutions and his afflictions which he had endured. We've seen a list of that before. He says he is ready to be offered, that he's in effect already being poured out as a drink offering. And he talks about his departure being very close. The word literally is unloosing, letting go of this life. And he talks about it in summary as being a fight or a contest, using the idea of striving in the games. And that in that athletic picture, he talks about having finished his course or his race. And the course of his life was almost ended. And in chapter 4, verse 8, he says in that context, and this is for us as well, is it not? That when we ponder not just his life, but our life, our thoughts go to the future more and more, don't they? Don't they? The past is slipping away. There's not as much left ahead as there was once. And so we think more, for various reasons, about the appearing of our Lord. Perhaps it's to end our suffering, whatever. And we need to clearly have not just a sense of that will be a relief and it will be good for the planet or whatever, but we love it. We just love it. We can't wait until that day comes. If only he would come today. If only I didn't have to think about tomorrow and the next day. If only he would come right now. But you know, some of us actually don't feel that way. Some of us are afraid of the coming of the Lord. And it often is older people. And some of you are aware, because I've mentioned it to you and you've agreed, that sometimes people in our nursing homes are actually afraid of dying. I was discussing with a sister, a very elderly sister, in our nursing home recently, and she said, we were talking about the coming of Christ, and she was excited in one sense by it, and she said, "Oh, but I'm really worried about the sins of my youth." And I said, "But they've all been washed away." She said, "Oh, do you think so?" "Yes," I said. Isn't it curious that some of us still are worried about our sins? Well, that's a big subject. We can't go there now. But it really does come down to what do we think about the coming of the Lord. Come with me to 1st of John. And I will have to stop at this one, even though I've got some more references on my slide, which I'll leave you to just look at. In 1st of John 2 and verse 28, the apostle says, "And now, little children, abide in him, that when he shall appear, we may have confidence and not be ashamed before him at his coming." And I guess if I put it to you very plainly, are you feeling confident about the coming of the Lord? You'd probably not say yes. You might go, well, but. Well, there's no buts here. Come over to chapter 4, verse 17. "Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment." It's the same Greek word as confidence. Boldness in the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world. Well, look, John, I'm sorry, but you must be on another planet. There's no way I'm going to be bold in the day of judgment. or confident, that's the last thing I would feel. I'll be crawling on my hands and knees begging for mercy. I'm not going to walk up to Christ and say, oh, I'm ready. Where's the door into the kingdom? Thank you. Well, of course, that isn't quite what John is saying, and we shouldn't read into it something that isn't there. But there's a big help in looking at the same word used in chapter 3, verse 21. Behold, if our heart condemn us not, then have we confidence toward God. And it's also in chapter 5, verse 14. This is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he heareth us. Now, those two passages are talking about our present confidence. And it's in the context of prayer. If our whole life has been lived before God as an open book, and we talk to him about everything and anything, and we confess our faults frequently and seek for help all the time, there's nothing left to discuss at the judgment seat. And if our life is an open book, and the word in the Greek means freedom of speech, openness, there's nothing hidden. Nothing. We haven't hidden anything from him now, so we are, in that sense, confident in him now. Then the first two references will be true as well. We will have every confidence in him then as well. And so there's a whole number of other verses which I can't now have time to read. Perhaps just the second last one. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom.